Hi everyone, welcome. Hey, Siri, how many days have passed since the 23rd of March?
It was 300 days ago.
300 days. What a milestone age for a worm bin, 300 days. It's quite a while. Over that time, this bin here of ANCs, which is African nightcrawlers, my abbreviation for African nightcrawlers, they've received 24 feedings, the last of which was 10 days ago. And it was a feeding that consisted of a couple days worth of coffee and some worm chow. It was all meant to be bite-sized food, type of food that we'd see no leftovers of the next time we checked in on it. And we did also sort of semi-commit to coming back in here in 10 days, if things turned out properly and the timing of things, to, wish this bin well on its 300th day in service. And I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. We did talk about making this next feeding its last feeding, feeding number 25 on day 300 being its last feeding. And it might very well be that. But I've got a special idea for feeding these guys today. So come with me, I'll show you what I'm talking about. My idea was to bring the bin in here, into my time-lapse booth. And from this angle you can kind of see the lighting source, which is just some Christmas lights hanging overhead. And the camera is mounted on a fairly rigid little shelf bracket. And I'm actually using my somewhat newer GoPro Hero 9 Black Edition to shoot the video. And this black tub is not what's going to be here. I'm going to be actually bringing in the tub that the worms live in. And what I'm going to be feeding them is already in here, sort of going through a little bit of a on-camera rehearsal. And some of you might have already sort of anticipated what it might be. It's one of the many pumpkins that I gathered at the end of the Halloween season when people putting their old pumpkins out on the curb to be taken away by the trash man. I spotted a whole pile of them, and this was one of them. And my idea was to feed this to the ANCs on their 300th day in service, and at the same time filming it so that we can observe their progress as they eat it. So I got a little bit of work to do. I've got to carve that pumpkin out, empty it, hollow it out, so that I could do my little trick of actually plopping worms into the emptied out, hollowed out pumpkin. And then what else? Let's see. I got to gather up the worms out of that other bin. I don't know. I got a few things to do, so I don't really know, how much of this I'm going to capture on camera. We'll see. We'll see how I feel, but I do have work to do. So let me get back into the wormery, grab that pumpkin, carve it up, pull the seeds out. I got to gather up the worms. Yeah, I got stuff to do. So we'll check in again soon. Now I thought I'd provide at least a little bit of explanation as to what went down there. It was me picking all the distractions out of the material, any sort of mainly banana stems it seems. I found a few bits of tomato skin, a couple chunks of corn cob, and I'm sure there's a good bit of it remaining, but I figured as long as I was encountering stuff that could distract the worms from, focusing on the pumpkin, I would extract those things. And obviously the main focus there was just to separate worms from castings without putting too much of an emphasis on being 100% thorough, because in the end it doesn't matter if there's some worms still hanging out in the material that the pumpkin's going to be placed onto. But as far as, rounding up some recruits to place into the pumpkin, I think we did a nice job. So we're just going to place them into this container here for a short little while until we can get the pumpkin prepped, and then they could be loaded in and I guess it doesn't matter if we provide them with a little bit of familiar material here to keep them from freaking out too badly, although I'm probably it's probably safe to assume that they're not too thrilled about what just went down there. But I guess just to sum up quickly, that was about 45 minutes, and I ran my time-lapse camera to capture that. I'll be curious to see how the footage turns out. Hopefully it turned out good. But now it's on to hollowing out the pumpkin so that we could place our little subjects in there and get this time lapse underway. So now anybody who's ever carved a jack-o'-lantern doesn't need me to show them how to open up a pumpkin and pull out all the seeds. So I took a few moments to take care of that off camera. However, normally it's the top of the jack-o'-lantern or the pumpkin that gets cut off, but in this case we've removed the bottom, leaving the top of it kind of nice and, you know, photogenic with the stem and everything in place. And luckily I've got this nice little box here which allows me to work on my pumpkin in such a way that I don't damage or interfere with the stem. Because once we put this into the camera's eye and we start filming, I kind of like the idea of having that big stem up there. Showing how the whole thing's collapsing and everything like that. So really quick, what I've got here is some of my bedding, which we're going to use as sort of stuffing to follow the worms. So here might be a little bit difficult to see them, but the worms are in here underneath that little pile of castings. And a little deviation from how I once did this before, my first pumpkin video where it was worms versus pumpkin, I just threw the worms in and then I packed it with stuffing, you know, bedding to keep the worms in there, but I didn't really do anything to prevent them from diving down out of the pumpkin and back down into the bedding. So my idea was, after the worms go in, I've got a couple of these coffee filters here. I thought that we would throw the worms in, a little bit of bedding, and then this would come in right after them, and I would pack it in there in such a way that now they would have really no way to dive out of the pumpkin. Naturally, they can nibble their way through this piece of paper, but for the most part, it would serve as an obstacle to keep them up in the pumpkin, hopefully occupied with some bedding and obviously the food that we want them consuming. So I'm really excited. Let's not wait. Let's get this thing going. Let's get the worms in here. I just figured it would be kind of nice to follow the worms with some of this familiar material so that once we invert the whole setup, this is what they're going to be resting on top of, this little mound of castings that they've sort of squirmed out of and tried to, you know, retreat out of the bright lights. And by removing that, now we've really pretty much got just a tub of worms in here. So in go the worms, carefully, slowly. Oh, well, perhaps not as carefully or as slowly as I anticipated. So let's see. We've still got a few more in here. Well, you know, it doesn't matter. It's all going in there. I'll just kind of keep all this together so that we can follow the worms. But I lost a little bit of the material here too. So let's see, how does this look in here? Pretty cool. Whole lot of worms. I'm just thinking if I could sort of spread them out and level them off, just to sort of help them get situated, then we could begin piling in a little bit of their castings to provide them with that familiar material. And then I thought maybe followed up with a little bit of little bit of the bedding. So let's, oh, you know what? So now I wasn't too sure if it would really make much difference, if any. But, you know, whenever we feed our worms, or not whenever, but usually a lot of times when we feed our worms, we give them a little bit of grit So I thought that perhaps we could drop in a little bit of this pulverized eggshell. It's kind of interesting how they're reacting to that. You figured they would appreciate it. And, you know, the whole idea behind the grid is that it's supposed to help them eat their foods, you know? And that's what we want. We want them eating their food. Okay, so now on top of the worms, I thought we'd return this little batch of somewhat familiar material for the worms to have. There's even a few worms in there too. I'm just going to spread it out a little bit. And I don't know how much it's going to help or what it's going to do, but it just seemed like, you know, what's the harm in giving them a little bit of that stuff too to have. And then I'm going to begin stuffing. Before we put it in one of those barriers to prevent them from diving, I'm going to be grabbing some of this prepared bedding. It's just shredded paper and cardboard combined with leaves and water to make for what I believe the worms to consider as a fairly nice bedding material. It's been sitting and soaking for quite some time now. I'm grabbing a portion from the more aged end of the bin, because I did recently replenish the supply. So the stuff that I'm pulling out of the container here is actually some of the older stuff. And we'll add more, but I believe that the next thing I want is the barrier, so that they could dive down into this bedding and hang out and sort of nibble on some, you know, carbon-based bedding type material if they want to kind of mix it up and not eat only pumpkin, but without giving them a route out of the pumpkin. So in is going to go our first barrier. So it's just going to rest in here. I'm going to stuff it all the way around in such a way that, you know, a really desperate worm that wants very much to get out of this thing might get lucky and might find their way around the outer edge and sneak past our barrier. Or, you know, a worm that really feels like they've got to get out might just start nibbling through it. But that's not going to be the only barrier. We're going to put in a little bit more bedding and follow it up with yet another barrier. And my hope is that by doing it this way, we're going to keep the worms in the pumpkin for the most part. And I mean, you saw when I was separating the worms from their castings, there's also a good number of worms still in the material that the pumpkin is going to be rested on top of. And my hope is that all of this nice fresh pumpkin material that's going to be rested onto the bin, direct access to the surface of the material, will also draw the worms and bring them over, and they'll start nibbling it from below. So hopefully this pumpkin is going to start getting eaten from all angles. I'm even wondering if I should stuff further, and I've got more coffee filters behind me, and it seems like we could actually fit a little bit more stuffing in here just to keep everything up at the top of the pumpkin as much as possible. I mean, I know that once we turn it upside down, gravity will do its thing and it'll create a little bit of a cavity up on the upper inside portion. But if I can stuff this thing pretty full, then hopefully it'll keep a good number of worms right there at the top surface of the pumpkin, feeding on even that. So yeah, why don't I grab yet another piece of paper to sort of cap this thing off. I guess the other option would have been just to grab that end of the pumpkin over there and cap it off, and that would almost guarantee that the worms are staying in, at least until they can chew around the edge. But I didn't want to make it that difficult. If they want out, they can get out, but it will take a little bit of doing for them to do that. So I think before we jam this in here, I'm going to grab a little bit more stuffing, a little bit more bedding to place right here on top, And then as we stuff it in, we're going to pretty much have this thing packed. And that should pretty much ensure that the worms are going to be right up on top. Direct access to the very tippy top of the pumpkin. And, you know, just the nature of the worms, they're going to dive. They're going to make their way past these little barriers, presumably. It almost makes me feel like maybe I should actually give them at least one route out if they really want it out. Maybe I should just create one slit down the middle through both, not both, all three barriers. So my only concern is actually getting to the point where I'm carving into worms, which I don't want to have happen. So whatever, I'm pretty confident that we've at least punctured 2 of the 3 barriers. If that first barrier right at the very upper level, you know, what's going to be the upper level once we turn this thing over, remains with no hole in it, they'll still be able to get by it around the edge. So we're almost at that point where we can introduce the star of the show into its container, and the camera's actually filming already. So without any further ado, let's get this time lapse started. So now I wanted to make sure I've got the orientation in such a way that this big scab is on the back, and I believe that the side that I wanted forward is right here. Okay, so that means I should simply be able to invert the whole thing and position it in front of the camera. Okay. Now, I guess I'm sort of squashing it down into the bed a little bit. Kind of makes it look pretty squat. I mean, it is a pretty squat shaped pumpkin. And, oops, let's not leave any castings on it. We want a nice, tidy looking scene. So, that's it. Welcome to my newest time lapse. Let's check back in about a month and see how it looks. Alright everyone, that's it for today's video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. A little peer into the creation of one of my time lapses. And this one's going to be fun. If you can see kind of a preview of what it looks like here on the GoPro camera's screen, it's got a pretty good framing. I'm just wondering if maybe it almost feels like I should have it closer, or the camera pointing up higher or something. I don't know why. Now is the time to make any sort of fine adjustments. Let me see if I can bring this thing in a little bit closer to fill up a little bit more of the frame. Make sure everything's nice and centered. And now we can let the worms get to work. Alright everyone, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye.